Hello, everybody. It's me, Tammy Devine, here with DFE's Eternal Impact. I love this interview series because it's just talking to wonderful people who are making an eternal impact, making a difference for the kingdom of God. And I am so excited to introduce you to my guest today. Full disclosure, my guest today is Kim Kargbo, who is actually my sister as well. It's so good to see you. Thanks, Kim, for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.
Yeah. I know people are going, that's your sister? Like,
Yeah,
anything alike.
I know. I know.
So I'll just explain real fast. Yes, that really is my sister. Her name used to be Kim Kimball, and my name used to be Tammy Kimball. And I was adopted by the Kimball family when I was 6 years old out of Sierra Leone, West Africa, from a mud hut to now to the mountains in Colorado. And the Kimball family is really the only family I've ever known since I was 6 years old. And my biological mother died, and they adopted me, brought me to the U.S. with them, just loved me and treated me as their own, and helped me get an education and have adventures I could never have dreamed of as a little girl in a mud hut in Sierra Leone. So Kim really is my sister, and I am very excited to be talking with her today. So Kim, you run Accessible Hope International. How long has this been going on, and why did you start it?
Well, yeah, thanks. The the Ministry of Accessible Hope is 15 years old. How I got into it is a bit of a long story, maybe longer than we have time for today, but I'll give you sort of this brief synopsis.
I want to hear.
Um, yeah, the whole story is real long, but
Okay.
but but the way that I got into it really was, I mean, I just like to tell people it was a surprise to me as well. I didn't set out to try to start anything. I wasn't looking for something to do. Um, I had been involved in ministry in Sierra Leone previous to this, from like 1998 to 2002. I was doing war relief with amputees in Sierra Leone, and at that time, I connected with a woman who just felt like the Lord wanted her to go to Sierra Leone and do some work among amputees there. She herself was an amputee. So I had connected with her way back in that previous ministry. And then somewhere along the line, she contacted me around 2008 and said, "Hey, would you help us? We want to start." She had started a ministry for men with amputations in Sierra Leone. It was a soccer ministry because she herself, when she was younger, she was an older woman at the time, but when she was younger, was instrumental in starting the amputee FIFA sport. So amputee soccer is a FIFA sport, and she was instrumental in getting that whole movement started. And when she was like in her 20s, and so she started an amputee soccer league in Sierra Leone, and it was a ministry. But then she said in 2008, she's like, "I would really love to start something for women," because at that time women were not playing soccer in Sierra Leone, and so she's like, "I know we need to do something different. Would you come along as a consultant and help us? We're going to go do just kind of retreat, and then we'll see where it goes from there." I was not able to go with her to Sierra Leone to do the retreat for women with amputations that she had envisioned, but she did take a team of people. And so I went ahead and went with her, went to them and just did sort of an orientation with them. So I wasn't able to go to Sierra Leone, but I went to Seattle where all these women resided and had a little bit of a orientation weekend with them on what to expect in Sierra Leone and how to kind of go about some of the trauma healing that they wanted to do, did some translation for them. And they went and did that. And then a year later, she contacted me and she's like, "Okay, we want to go again, but this time you really have to go." And I was like, "Okay, well, I'll check and see if I can. But let me ask this. What is your goal in putting together another retreat for these women with amputations?" She goes, "I just want to have a long-term impact on their lives." And so I, as carefully as I could, said, "Do you think that a 2-day retreat once a year is going to do that?" And she's like, "No, I don't, but I don't know what else to do." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, what if we gather together the people that are working alongside you and have this shared passion? And what if we spend a weekend doing a strategic planning retreat and see what might come out of that? So I went back to Seattle and met for 3 days with a group of women in one woman's home. We stayed with her in her home for the weekend and just had a lovely time of praying and seeking the Lord on what would God want to do and what was God already doing among these women with, at that time, we were thinking of women with amputations. Through the course of that weekend, things evolved, lots of conversations were had, and we realized that women with amputations was too small of a population for a ministry focus, and so it expanded to women with disabilities. And then at the end of that weekend, I agreed to take a smaller group. There were 12 women that were at that weekend planning retreat. I agreed to take a smaller group of 7 to Sierra Leone to do sort of a needs assessment and just kind of get the ball rolling and see what we needed to do, and also really understand what were the needs of women with disabilities and what might be able to be done to come alongside them. So I thought taking that group to Sierra Leone in October of 2009 was the end of my contribution to that whole
Little did you
escapade.
know.
And while we were there, it was really a very dramatic story that took place that was literally life-changing for me, and just sort of threw me for a loop, because I really did think I was going to help them, do this needs assessment, and we were all going to go home, and then I would be like, all right, well, call me if you have any questions. I'm available. And it became very crystal clear to me during that time that we were in Sierra Leone during that initial needs assessment trip that was not the plan at all, and that God had some much bigger things in store for me and for the ministry really as a whole.
Okay. And so that turned into, it wasn't Accessible Hope right away, right?
No. When we first started, we were only working with women with disabilities in Sierra Leone, and it was Women of Hope International was the name of the ministry. And then at our 10-year anniversary in 2019, by that time, our ministry had begun to expand, and we were getting so many requests from all over the world, like, come and help us. We need this ministry too, and that sort of thing. And we didn't really have capacity for that. But we had put together a training package that we had started to use with churches around the world in many different places. And we ended up calling it a theology of disability, because what we realized as we worked in Sierra Leone, that the stigma against people with disability was so strong, even in the church, that as women were coming to know that God created them just like they were, that God loved them just as they were, and that that they had a purpose and they were made in God's image, as they started to want to go find out more about this God that loved them, and they would, head to where they thought they might learn more about God, to church, right? And they were literally being kicked out of church, like not allowed to enter. And so we're like, oh, wow, that's going to be really challenging for discipleship. And so we started putting together some training for churches and pastors and church leaders to help them rethink their idea about disability from a biblical lens, and hopefully to open the doors for people with disabilities to be able to access the church and be able to join into the body of Christ. And so that training, which started out as sort of a one-day workshop, began to evolve. And then eventually we were offering that globally to churches, ministries, pastors, church leaders, as a theology of disability workshop. And so as that continued to evolve, then we realized our name is actually becoming a little bit of a barrier for us, because in a lot of places in the world, we were an organization called Women of Hope, mostly staffed by women. And in most places in the world, that is not okay. So women are not going to do theological training for anybody, right? And pastors are not going to come to a workshop that is by a women's ministry, and they're just going to be like, that's not for us, right? Or they have no business teaching us, or whatever their particular ilk of theological belief is. So we realized that the name Women of Hope International was actually a bit confusing, and was a barrier to some of the places that we wanted to be able to do training, and to people actually coming to the training. And so we started to think about rebranding since the work was expanding beyond what we were doing in Sierra Leone. It was no longer just women, because we were also then equipping the church to look at people with disabilities and reach people with disabilities differently. And then wanted to be able to see if there were other programs similar to Women of Hope in Sierra Leone. So they were Women of Hope in Sierra Leone, the ministry that was started there, but similar to them, but maybe reaching other groups of vulnerable people with disabilities that were not just women, maybe whole families or maybe children or whatever. So in 2019, at our 10-year anniversary, we rebranded to Accessible Hope International. And then Women of Hope Sierra Leone stayed the same, and we continue to partner with them. But then we were able to sort of expand our reach beyond just that women's ministry.
And so in Africa and other parts of the world, mainly women, I think, are kind of stigmatized. They are the lowest on the totem pole. I should say disabled women too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They are, sometimes just invisible in society, or if they are visible, they're exploited, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is
Yeah.
that kind of where your heart
Yeah.
went, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and really what we see, particularly, so of the programs now that we have under the umbrella of Accessible Hope, there's several different programs that are now under our umbrella, but Women of Hope Sierra Leone is the largest and also the one we've partnered with the longest, being that it was the founding ministry. But the women, like you said, that women are already at the low end of the totem pole in a society. Most of Africa, a lot of Asia, same kind of thing, where women are really seen as second-class citizens or even less than second class. And then add a disability to that, which stigmatizes them further. They really are not just invisible in that people just don't notice them, but they're actually hidden. So what we find, particularly in both in the schools that we partner with that are serving children with disabilities and in the program in Sierra Leone for women with disabilities, what we find is that there's a lot of women, when they finally get connected with Women of Hope, the ministry there in Sierra Leone, they have not had any interaction whatsoever with anybody. They have literally been hidden away in a home. Either because of shame or because their family has isolated them intentionally, and told them not to come out so that they don't create shame for the family, or they've self-isolated because of their own shame regarding their disability. And so for a lot of women, the connection with Women of Hope and the ministry there is really the first time that they have even seen that there are other women that are just like them that also have disabilities but are living fruitful and thriving lives. That's the first time they've actually made friends or had any relationship of any kind. They've maybe been rejected by their family, rejected by a husband if they received their disability later, or just rejected by the society as a whole and have hidden themselves away or have been hidden away by others. So it's really their first place of connection and belonging when they join Women of Hope and become part of the larger group. And the same thing with children, that a lot of times children with disabilities are literally just hidden away. Often there's a little bit of a kindness in it. Like maybe the family is an agrarian family. They're all going off to the farm. Well, as the child gets bigger, they're not able to carry the child to the farm. And so they'll lock the child in a room for the whole day while the family's gone, partly to protect it. Because they can't really take the child along if the child is, not mobile. And so they'll just lock a child in a room. So sometimes there's it doesn't feel kind to us in looking at it, because that child is literally going to be locked in that room all day alone. But, there is sometimes the idea of protection, like we don't want something to happen to him or her. Other times children are tied to a tree outside for the whole day while the family's gone, in the backyard or whatever. And so, and that might be, also so that it can't run away or so that it doesn't, wander off, but then also it's not messing up the room, and so there's a lot of thought that goes into those decisions sometimes. And sometimes it's really just desperation. They just don't have options. Sometimes it is because they really think of that child as not a human, right? And so there's a lot, it's very complex. But even with children in the schools that we partner with, one in Tanzania and one in southern Sierra Leone, which is the opposite part of the country from where our women's program is, they there's often children that are brought to these schools who have not had interaction with anybody outside of that until the school, maybe takes note of them, or somebody mentions there's this child at this home that could use your services or something like that. So, going to school is really a child safe place, especially a school that is specifically catering to children with special needs, and is able to really just love and care for them and their needs in the way that they need.
This picture that we're looking at is the Tanzania school, right?
Yes.
Okay. And how long ago was that one established?
That school's been around for 20 years. So the program itself, the school itself, predates our partnership with them. We just started partnering with them a few years ago, but they had gone through our training, the Theology of Disability training, and then we're looking for additional partners, and we had some things in our partnership offerings that would benefit them. And so we became a formal partner with Step by Step Learning Center is the name of the school. And the proprietress's name is Margaret. So the reason why the school was started is that years ago, her daughter Ruth was sick with a very high fever and ended up with a brain injury as a result of the high fever. And then she was unable to find any kind of educational setting that would be appropriate for her daughter. And so she started one. So she started it for her daughter. Her daughter, now Ruth, is 40. But she started it years and years ago to help Ruth have a place to go to school, but then also for other children like Ruth in the community. And so that's how that school started. And Margaret is an amazing, amazing woman. She is now in her early 70s, would love to be able to retire and hand the school to someone else, but she has not yet found somebody that has the same passion as she does for these kids and for the education that they receive. So far, she's not able to find somebody to take up the school, which is really a heavy weight on her. But hopefully God will provide that in time.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk a lot about, Kim, is people being made in the image of God, including those with disabilities. And I just wonder how you're able to get that across to cultures that have no concept of that.
So all of a lot of what we do is training. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to grab something from my shelf right here. A lot of what we do is training, and it's training for the people with disabilities, but also, the Theology of Disability training is for leaders and community leaders, church leaders around people with disabilities. But the key story, and it's present in both our training for women with disabilities and also in our Theology of Disability training. We have really a parable. So we use a lot of highly participatory learning methods, stories, parables, discussions, activities to really get people interacting with the material, with what they think already, and then where maybe the scripture kind of bumps up against what they currently think, and then what do we do with that, right? And so in fact, our Theology of Disability training follows that same pattern every lesson. So it starts with, what do we currently think or know? And even our trainings with the women in Sierra Leone, same thing. What do we currently think? What does the new information say? Like, what's something new that we can learn about that particular topic? And then if those things are not the same, what do we do with that? So if scripture is different than what we thought, if Jesus says that people with disabilities are precious, but we thought they were demons, well, now what? What do we do with those two differences? And then wrestling with that through some activities or whatever. And then what now do we do about that? So if we realize that, we're going to probably need to change how we think about that, then what do we do? But the lesson that is key in helping people understand that people with disabilities are made in God's image, and keeping in mind that the countries where we work are primarily Muslim. And so there definitely is a very high view of God, even though there's not lots of Christians. And so that idea of being made in God's image, first of all, we, especially with the women, when we are doing training with them, we sort of start to shift like, who is God and what is God like? Because if the God that you know has different characteristics than the one true God, then you might need to kind of rethink God first. And then to be made in that God's image puts a whole different spin on being made in God's image. But we have a story called The Wood Carver, and it's a parable about a wood carver in a village who was making a lot of different wood carvings. And some of them, the people around him in his village started noticing that some of these wood carvings were odd. They were like misshapen, or they were bent, or they were missing parts or something. And they were like, this is strange. Like, this wood carver is like the best wood carver in the whole nation. Why is he making these really weird wood carvings? And he wouldn't say anything about it. He just kept making them. And people could tell that he was very like enamored with these carvings, but they were like, this is so strange. He could make the best. So finally, somebody out of curiosity said, Carver, we noticed that you're making these wood carvings, and they're quite ugly. Why? Because you're the best wood carver in the nation. So you could make beautiful wood carvings, but you're making these and they're kind of ugly. And so the wood carver picks up one of the carvings and says, well, that's where you're wrong, because you see this particular carving as ugly, but I see it as beautiful. And I know why I created it like this. It also, every carving that I make has part of me in it. I've put myself in heart and soul into the carving of this object. And these are precious to me because I made them exactly how I wanted to. And so the parable then ends with, the people go away with a new understanding of what is beautiful and what is precious. So that parable and story, and I have in the manual that we have a little story of, it's illustrated, but that story is really where there's an aha moment for people where they're like, oh, wait, okay. And then, we have a whole conversation, like in the parable, who is the wood carver and who are the people and who are the carvings? And so that really helps people to kind of wrestle with like, oh, maybe what I've thought about people with disabilities, that they're ugly or they're, broken or useless or whatever, might be wrong. And then, they can kind of start wrestling with that on their own. And even the women themselves, that's very early in our training that we do. It's called transformation training. It's a 16-week training that they can opt to go through. And that's one of the first lessons that they encounter. And it really is the pivotal point for most of them, where they all of a sudden start realizing, wait, the lies that I've been told all my life about who I am were wrong. God made me in his own image, and I have value because of that. And it just starts to shift the way they see themselves, the way they treat themselves, the way they take care of themselves, the way they even walk or express themselves in their community. And then as that shift takes place, the community around them starts to shift the way they see them too. Because, when a person starts to think, I think I am precious, I think I am lovable, other people start to see them differently too, because they just start to exude a different sort of vibe, and so other people around them start to notice that they're different and start to see them differently. So that's really kind of the starting point for that whole shift in seeing people as being image bearers. And then, there's a lot more that goes into the training after that. But.
Wow, that parable is beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
And about exuding that inner beauty. I think also it's like a reflection of Christ. It's like
Mm-hmm.
once you have Jesus in you, you have a different kind of way of thinking, and it shows through
Mm-hmm.
when you really are in relationship with Him.
Yeah.
So wow, that's really great. Let's talk about. Oh, there's so much I want to talk about with you. Let's talk about the three pillars of Accessible Hope
Sure.
International. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we already kind of have touched on them,
A little
but
bit.
maybe
Yeah.
go into a little more detail
Yeah.
about equip, empower, and engage.
Uh-huh. So Equip is our training arm. So that's the global trainings that we do, the theology of disability, training church leaders, pastors, ministry leaders, whole ministry staff, whoever requests it, really. training them on a theology of disability. And part of our theology of disability training, if you take the full training, walks that group, whoever that is, or that church or whoever, through a process of seeing, okay, here's where we are right now in our engagement with people with disability. And here are some steps that we can take to start to move ourselves up sort of a scale of engagement and inclusion of people with disabilities. And so, and not to jump from like, we're doing nothing, or we see people with disabilities as trash, to like, wow, they're amazing and we're co-laboring with them. Like there's steps that have to take place in between. And we just want to see forward movement, not like jump all the way to the end. That's impossible. But because shifts in our mind and our behaviors and our attitudes take time. And so, we just want to see people starting to think differently, and then see their attitudes and their actions start to follow that. So we do walk different organizations and churches in that training through sort of a process of what their own individual organization or church or whatever could do to start to move themselves toward more inclusion of people with disabilities. So that's our Equip branch. And then Empower is our partnership program, where we are partnering with locally run organizations on the ground, primarily in Africa, that are serving people with disabilities in a very holistic and hands-on way. So I've mentioned already all three of the groups that we're working with, Women of Hope, currently Women of Hope in Sierra Leone, Northern Sierra Leone, and that's a women program for women. There's about 800 women in the program in Sierra Leone.
Wow. I didn't know you had that many. That's huge.
Yeah, it's because we're now in 3 districts all over the north. So all the way from McKinney out toward the west, and then all the way up toward the very top corner of Sierra Leone. So there's a lot of outposts, we call it. So our office is in the center, but from there, then there's a lot of outreach and programming that goes on around the whole north. And then Nyandenga is the school that's in southern Sierra Leone. That school has been around for about 5 years. And yes, okay. That's from Nyandenga. So they have a school and a daycare also for kids with disabilities. And they have about 115 kids in their program. Only about 25 of them actually attend the school. The rest of them, because of barriers like transportation issues, distance, caregiver issues, are not able to come to the school. So the staff makes home visits to them periodically and helps the families with their children in whatever ways they need assistance. And then Step by Step Learning Center is in Tanzania, Arusha, Tanzania. And that has, off the top of my head, I think it's around 40 kids and young adults. So they have about 20 some kids in the traditional school program. And then they have, I think it's maybe 30 kids in the traditional program. And then they have a vocational training program for young adults. And I think there's about 15 to 20 kids in that program as well, or young adults in that program. So those are kids that have aged out of the traditional school system, but now are being taught skills and vocational skills for income generation so that they can help support themselves. So that's Empower. That's the partnership program with organizations that are serving people with disabilities on the ground. And then lastly is Engage. And that's just sort of our partnership and consulting arm that works with other ministries that maybe are doing really good work around the world. But as they start looking at their constituency, they realize, oh, wait, 16% of the world's population has a disability. We don't have nearly 16% of our population that we serve have a disability. So they must be missing, right? And so kind of helping them process through that missing piece of people in their community who are not being served by their programming, whatever that might be, whether that's church planning or disciple making movements or relief and development or wells and sanitation or whatever their ministry strategy is, that people with disabilities, if they're not already thoroughly engaged in their programming, that's a whole population that is largely unreached and that they're missing in their engagement. So that's our Engage program.
Okay. I want to talk about your heart for starting the organization off in Sierra Leone. I think there was good reason, right? Because you did a lot growing up there.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, like this ministry is sort of the way that when I was in, as I mentioned, had this sort of very dramatic aha moment in Sierra Leone, where the Lord really just showed me that everything up to that point had been leading to that point, that the Lord had used all these different pieces of my life. So, as you know, and as you also experienced, I grew up in Sierra Leone in a small village. And I was there a lot longer than before we had you in our family, because we had been there for about 3 or 4 years before you came along. Well, we knew you, but not before you came into our home. And so I had grown up in Sierra Leone most of my sort of formative years, schooling years, until my senior year of high school. And then came back to the States for my senior year of high school, and then went to college, became a nurse with the direct goal of going to the mission field, not necessarily to Sierra Leone, but going to the mission field. I had really received quite a very specific calling to people who are unreached. When I was a young teenager, when I was 12, I really felt a direct call to missions from the Lord. And then when I was 14, through some reading that I was doing and some things that I had heard, really felt the Lord calling me to those that had no access to the gospel. And so that was really my driving force all the way through high school and college, was going to the mission field to reach those who are completely unreached. And my plan was to do that as a nurse. So after I got out of nursing school, I was working in the States, just kind of, paying off some school loans and getting some experience and whatever. And a friend of mine who also grew up in Sierra Leone called me one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to go back to Sierra Leone and work at the mission hospital there near where we lived for 3 months. You want to come?" And I was like, "Well, sure. Okay." So we just quit our jobs. She was also a nurse. We just quit our jobs and went to Sierra Leone for 3 months. Wow. And she stayed for 3 months. I stayed for 3 years. So I just ended up there for a much longer period of time as I started working in the hospital, which I very quickly came to discover is not my cup of tea. I'm not a hospital girl. I realized that, wow, there are children dying daily in this hospital from completely preventable illnesses, from things like measles, from things like malnutrition, from things like malaria, like all these very preventable diseases, if people knew what caused them and how to prevent them. And so I proposed to the hospital administration, what if I don't work in the hospital, but I go start a community health education program in the area around the hospital and start hoping to educate people around the hospital of what it would look like to start doing health promotion and disease prevention, so that we could reduce the number of people in the hospital. Well, at the time, the hospital was overrun with patients. I mean, we would see in the outpatient clinic 350 people a day, and there was one doctor. And so it was a 70-bed hospital. There were usually 100 to 150 patients in the 70-bed hospital all the time. So it was just overrun with patients. And they're like, "We cannot let you do that because we are too busy." And I was like, "Right, but hear me out. I want to reduce how busy we are. Like, that is what I want to do. I want to go where the problem is and see if we can stop it at the source and not let people into the hospital with these very preventable diseases." And it was a hard sell. I'm telling you, I had to fight tooth and nail. I mean, and to the point where
you could do it. You could do it.
I mean, it was actually like, I finally was like, okay, then I'm a volunteer. I'll just go home. Like, wow. If I'm not working in that hospital anymore, like, I'm not doing it. So either you can let me do this program and stay here, and I'll try to diminish the number of people coming into the hospital every day, or I'm just going to leave because I am not working in this hospital anymore. Mm-hmm. So they're like, "Oh, well, okay, given that option, maybe you could go ahead and do that." So I started a community health education program around the area of the hospital, which went on for a number of years until the war really stopped everything in that area, including shutting down the hospital. So, so that was, I did that for 3 years, but then it went on after I was gone as well. So I did that in Sierra Leone. And then, later the war broke out. I was later asked to help serve alongside a relief and development organization that was going to go into Sierra Leone to do some war relief, refugee work, and then just see what is it that might need to be done that's not being done by somebody else. And so I took a vision trip with the founder of that ministry to Sierra Leone. We went and sort of assessed the situation, realized that there were, at that time, the war was still pretty hot. There
But
were so
I'm sorry, please remember what you're going to say, but just to clarify to everybody, when you say the war, I think people know it as the Blood Diamond
yeah,
War.
yes. So it
That
was a decade-long civil war that was perpetrated by rebels who were being funded by Libyan forces that wanted diamonds from Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone is very diamond rich. Anybody who's seen the movie Blood Diamonds with Leonardo DiCaprio is that's the war. That's the story. That's the war. There was more to it than that. There's lots of nuances to war. There's never any one sort of cause or whatever. So there was a lot of complexity in the war. But one of the sort of defining characteristics of the war in Sierra Leone and neighboring Liberia was the use of amputation as the sort of weapon of choice in the war and to subdue people. And so people were having limbs cut off all the time. I mean, right and left. And I don't mean any puns by that, but that was the case. So there were people losing limbs all over the place. Now, many of those people, I mean, thousands and thousands of people, many of those people did not survive those brutal amputations. I mean, it wasn't like they were taking them to the hospital, amputating them. They were just like hacking people up with machetes and axes and things like that. And so many,
bleed out, right? Which
you
could
what?
cause it to
Yes,
just bleed out.
sure. Yeah. And lots of people did. Yeah. Or infection or, whatever. So lots of people didn't survive those amputations, but a lot of did. And so there was sort of this sudden ballooning of people with amputations in Sierra Leone, where, in the past, there was, I don't know, an occasional amputation here or there for, an accident while farming or whatever, just like what we would have here. But not at the scale. And there wasn't resources for those people. And so at that time, there was really nobody was working in Sierra Leone because the war was still very, very hot. So because the organization I was working with at that time was one of the first back into Sierra Leone looking at war relief, we saw that the needs of the people with amputations were really high on the priority list. They had nothing. They were just like in these squalid camps, just sort of languishing with no way of having anything to eat or anything to do, and just like crammed into these camps. And so that was where we started. And I started a program then during the war called Limbs of Hope. And that was really our amputee rehab program. And so I did that. Go ahead.
Yeah, just sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that I have been in broadcast journalism for nearly 30 years. And one of the greatest stories that I had the opportunity to tell was to be able to travel to Sierra Leone in '99 with you and document the work that you were doing with those amputees. And I will never forget the looks on their faces, just the joy when you provided those prosthetic limbs to them and they could suddenly function again. It was
Yeah.
so beautiful. And I was so grateful that WLEX, that I was working for, the NBC affiliate in Lexington at that time, allowed me to take their gear and to record and document you doing that and then running that as a story in the Lexington news market. That
Yeah.
was a big, big honor for me. And I'm
Yeah.
so grateful that you helped make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so I worked there and I did that for 5 years. So that was sort of my first really foray into disability work. And it wasn't because I was seeking that out. I was really, my heart was for Sierra Leone and just whatever needed to take place there to try to assist in that really tragic and traumatic situation. And
Mhm.
then I stepped back from that program in 2002. The war ended also in 2002. And the program continued for a little while, but then other organizations started coming in that were much bigger and much more well-resourced. And so we sort of just let them take over the rehabilitation of amputees. So then I stopped doing that and then had another baby. And then it was while I was doing that program that I met with this woman from Seattle who came also to Sierra Leone during that time to work with people with amputations. So that was how our lives intersected. And then later is when she asked me to come and help as a consultant and then this ministry sprang out of that. Right. Mm-hmm. So all these different pieces. And at some point I really, especially when this whole Accessible Hope or Women of Hope thing started, I was very confused because the Lord just kept putting me in places of service in Sierra Leone. And I was like, all right, like unreached people, like never heard the gospel. There have been missionaries in this country. It's a very small country for so long. This is not what I had in mind at all. I just don't understand. Why do you keep sending me back to Sierra Leone? And it was really on that assessment trip while we were there that the Lord, through another woman's story, really showed me that this was the place that God had prepared for me to serve. And it wasn't sort of, some far-flung place in, I don't know, Papua New Guinea in the middle of the jungle or something, which is what I had thought I was going to do all while I was growing up. And then, here I am in Sierra Leone, which was a very familiar place to me. I was very familiar with it. And so it just really, the Lord just showed me that had been all preparation and just a training ground for this ministry to take place. And then it was as we started that ministry, and then the founding board eventually asked me if I would lead the organization, which I wasn't looking for any. I was at that point homeschooling 3 children. Like I wasn't looking for more things to do. And so, really took time to think and pray about that, knowing it was going to be pretty life shifting, which it was. And accepted that, but then, really was like, I don't know that I know very much about disability, and if I'm going to lead a disability ministry, I better get a little more conversant with what does the Bible say about disability. And so I actually bought a separate Bible because the one I had was kind of big and I was going to be doing a lot of traveling and it was heavy. So I just bought a smaller one and I thought, okay, this Bible is going to be like how I mine the word of God for disability. And so I started with the Gospels and I just started reading through the Gospels, underlining every time I saw a place where disability was mentioned. And I was blown away.
Right? It's a lot, right?
Oh my gosh, so much. It's so much. Yeah, it's just everywhere. And I mean, even even when people talk about Jesus's sort of 2 things that he did while he was on earth was preaching, preaching the kingdom of God and healing the sick is what people say. Turns out most of the people he healed were not sick. They were disabled. So there's very few healings of sick people. I mean, there's a few where you could think of them off the top of your head, probably like Peter's mother-in-law and
the woman with the issue of blood.
Yes. And then there was like a centurion's servant, that was sick. And those are kind of it. Like the rest of the people that are, she was dead, so we don't really know. So yes, she was probably sick. There was so there was so many instances. All the rest of the miracles that we see of healings, turns out they're people with disabilities, not people that are sick. And so I really started noticing that that's who Jesus interacted with all the time. And then I came across this verse, not that I had not seen it before, but it just had never really struck me, where John the Baptist is in prison, right? And he's, looking at a pretty risky situation for himself. And Jesus is out doing his thing. And so John, though, I mean, this is a guy that knows what's up, right? And he sends his disciples to Jesus to ask him, are you the one, or should we look for someone else? Now think about that. Like John knew, if I was Jesus, there's so many things that I would have said in that moment. Like, well, remember that time when both of us were not yet born, or, there was that thing when you baptized me and all the things happened, this Holy Spirit, the voice.
Wait, was that after he baptized him?
Yes.
Oh, that's funny.
So, I mean, there's just so many ways I would have answered that if I was Jesus, but that is not what Jesus said. So Jesus says to John's disciples, go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. And
Wow.
blessed is he who is not offended by me.
Wow.
So I'm like, whoa. All he did was like be like, look at all the disabled people. If you want to know if I'm the Messiah, look at all the disabled people and go tell John that.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, if Jesus like anchors his identity on what is happening among the disabled in his community, that's pretty significant, right? Like I should pay attention to that. And so should the church, right? Like the church should be paying attention. Like if Jesus is that fixed on like what happens among people with disabilities is going to identify me and my followers, are we doing likewise? I don't think so, And so that was really a huge turning point. And then I started doing more research about disability and realized that people with disabilities around the world, of which there are 1.3 billion, mind you, so many people, are the largest group of unreached people in the world because they do not have access to the gospel, even in their communities who might be Christian. They themselves are barred from access to the gospel. And so all of a sudden it all clicked for me, right? And I was like, oh, wait. So I was just thinking about unreached wrong, right? And so the Lord like fulfilled this calling to me when I was 14, but in a totally unexpected way that I never even imagined. So
Wow. You haven't gone into detail on this, I don't think, but you brought it up a couple of times. And so I want to know if you can give more detail. And if not, that's fine. Just let me know. But you've alluded a couple of times to that moment. It was a woman's story that made you, it was an aha moment. Can you give more detail about that?
Sure, I
Okay.
will.
Okay.
So we were this was on this initial assessment trip, needs assessment trip to Sierra Leone in October of 2009. And one of the things that we did was we held focus groups with different groups of women, 10 women in each group, 6 different groups. So each group was a specific disability type. So we had a focus group of blind women. There were 10 blind women. We had a focus group of deaf women. There were 10 deaf women. We had a focus group of amputees or war wounded, I guess is what we kind of put them all in one group, people that had been disabled by the war. And then various other groups, leprosy, and then what in Sierra Leone they call polio, which doesn't necessarily mean they had polio, although most of them did, but not necessarily. They could have had some other illness or even an accident, which caused them to be crippled or paralyzed in a leg or an arm or 2 legs. And I mean, sometimes those would be like injuries from a badly given injection. Like when they were an infant, they were injected like into their buttocks instead of into their leg and hit a nerve, and it killed the nerve to their foot. So like they had paralyzed legs as a result of that. So that's a common paralysis injury. But they're all lumped together in Sierra Leone as polio. So that's what they're called. And we're, trying to help right the perceptions of causation for disability as well. But that was kind of how that group was formed. So this was all a group of women who either had polio and were paralyzed or had some other injury or something that had caused paralysis of a limb. And so what we did in these focus groups, each focus group was about 3 hours long. We would just listen to the story of every single woman in that group, 10 women, and just hear from them, like what their life had been like, what are some of the challenges that they experienced. We had some specific questions, but what were dreams that they had for themselves? There were a number of different questions, but this particular group, this was the last group of 6. So we had been sitting for 3 days now and just absorbing story after story after story. And I'm telling you, I worked there during the war, and these 3 days were more traumatic to me than anything that occurred during the war and what I experienced during the war, which was a lot. Because these were just horrific stories of abuse and neglect and that these women had experienced, often at the hands of their parents or family members who were supposed to have loved them. And so it was really traumatic to the group that was there listening, more to me because I understood the stories. So a lot of the women that had gone on this assessment trip did not understand most of what was being said, but I did
Because of
understand all
your
of it.
there in Africa.
Yeah, yeah. They
Dealt
went
with a lot of that.
the language, yeah, and they were not. So I was hearing. I mean, we were translating, but when you translate, often you're getting like summaries, But I was hearing everything that they were saying, and so it was a lot. And there was the woman that was wearing a pink dress, and she sat through this whole 3 hours. She was the last person to share. Her name was Martha. And she was staring at me the whole time that we were together for 3 hours, like not even in a good way, like just staring at me. It was very uncomfortable. Like I was like, why is this woman staring at me like this? I just didn't understand like what I couldn't read her face, but it didn't seem friendly. It didn't seem hostile, but it didn't seem friendly. I don't know. Like I was like, this is weird. Well, it was finally her turn. And so she said, she started her story. She said, my name is Martha. I'm from Tambiama. And I was like, wait, I'm from Tambiama too. And she's like, oh, I know you and I know your family.
Wow.
And she said it like that. Right. And I was like, okay, did we do something to her? Like I'm like super confused. And so she proceeds to tell her story. When she was little, she was from Tambiama, and she and this is the village that that I grew up in and that you came to live with us in, and you were born just just a little bit away from there. And she said, I was born with my leg like this. I don't know why. I don't know, my parents didn't know why, but they thought that I had a demon. And so they had taken me to all kinds of witch doctors and everything, trying to, fix me or whatever. And she said, I remember that at one point they took me to a witch doctor. They went to the sacred tree at the edge of the village, which was the cottonwood tree that was right in front of our house. And I knew that. And they had the ceremony.
The one we call the flamboyant tree? Okay, that was the
cottonwood tree. It's down by the road.
Okay.
And she said, and they took me there with the witch doctor, and they put me under a white cloth and sat me there. And then the witch doctor was, killing chickens and incantations and all sorts of things, trying to like drive this demon away from her. And she said, and I just remember that I was under there for hours and I was so hot. And finally, I was just fed up, and I just threw the cloth off of myself and came out, and everyone screamed and ran away and left me. And so she ended up crawling back into the village. So this tree is a little bit on the outskirts of the village, and she ended up crawling because she couldn't walk back to the village. And then no one really mentioned anything about it. But then the next day, they said, well, since you refuse, we're going to take you back to where you came from and let the spirits take you. And so they took her into she is telling the story. She said, they took me into the sacred bush. Well, then again, I was like, because the sacred bush was right behind our house, right? And we knew that was the sacred bush. That's where a lot of sort of witchcraft and secret ceremonies and things took place in this forest that was behind our house. And I mean, and we were quite aware when things were happening and when they weren't. When things were happening, we were not allowed to go there. And when they weren't, we could walk in there, and it was, to me, felt like a really beautiful, peaceful place. It was a really pretty forest, right? But there were a lot of sort of spiritual things that were happening in that.
Was that where they would have like the poetry and the plays and things like that? Or
no, this was behind the school, like behind back of the school.
I was really little, and so I think I was shielded from all of that. So this is all new. So wow.
Yeah. So she said they took me to the sacred bush that was behind our house, and there was a path that went from our house. It wasn't very far, past the school and then into the forest behind there. And she said, and they dug a hole and they buried me in the hole standing up, and I was buried up to my neck. And she said they would bring, her arms were out. She said they would bring, and they packed in the dirt and just buried her there. And so she said they would bring food, but it wasn't for me, it was for the spirits. And so every day someone would bring a new plate of food and leave it just outside of my reach. And she said, I remember like straining to reach, and hitting the plate to try to fling some of the rice toward her so she could pick it up off the ground and eat it. And then one day there was a man up in one of the trees, and he saw her there. He knew why she was there, but he had some compassion, and he brought some bananas and put them right next to her and walked away. Mm-hmm. And so she ate the bananas. It was really the first like real food that she had had in a few days. And she ate the bananas. And then when the people came back with the next plate of food for the spirits, they were like, "Where did you get these bananas?" And she's like, I don't know. A man just left them there and I ate them. And they got very angry, and they're like, "It's because you are eating too much. That's why you refuse to die." And so they never came back again, and no more food was brought even for the spirits. And so I asked her, I mean, at this point, we're all like on pins and needles, like listening to this story. And I said, "Wait, how long were you buried in the forest?" And she said, 10 days. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she said, and then as I really was just like ready to just give up and die, my aunt had found out that my family had decided to dispose of me in the forest. And she ran from a village 5 miles away, found me in the forest. She said I was almost dead at that point. She dug me out with her hands, carried me on her back to a stream, washed me off, and then put me on her back and carried me all the way back to her village 5 miles away. Amazing. Her aunt then raised her as her own and hid her for a couple of years, taught her how to walk, started her in school. And then at some point along the way, she said one day, my aunt said to me, "Get dressed and put on your nicest dress. We're going to go to Tambiama and go to church." And she said, so she did my hair real nice. I put on my best dress, and I walked because my aunt had taught me how to walk. And we walked to Tambiama to go to church. Now, again, I'm like reeling because there is one church in Tambiama and we were at it. So she said, we went to church. We sat through the service. After the service, she said, we went up to the pastor, and my aunt told him what had happened and who I was and how she came to have me. And she said, and the white man was there and he took pictures. And I was like, there's only one white man in this story. And so she said, then the pastor escorted my aunt and I to my parents' house and wanted to go and confront them with this whole story. Well, her parents, when they walked in, her aunt and her, were like, the pastor was like, "This is your daughter." And they're like, "No, it's not. Our daughter's dead."
Wow.
And she said, and so I walked up to my parents and I stared them dead in the eye. And then I turned around and walked away, and they knew it was me. And she said, and then they had nothing more to say. And my aunt took my hand and we turned around and walked away. The next day, they sent a representative from the family to her aunt's house 5 miles away and said, well, since she's not dead, we'd like her back. And her aunt was like, God brought her into my home and only God will take her out. You can leave now. And that was the last she saw of her family.
Amazing.
So her aunt continued to raise her. But meanwhile, in my own body, I am like, oh my gosh. And so I asked her, I was like, Martha, what year was that? And she's like, I don't remember what year it was, but I know how old I was. And I said, how old were you? And she said, I was 7. And I asked her how old she was right then. She was 2 years younger than me. So it was the very year that we moved to Tambiama that all of this happened.
Wow.
Well, I was undone. I was so angry. I got up because in my world, even up to that point, I was a full-grown adult at that point. In my world, Sierra Leone had been such an idyllic place, like just really safe, just wonderful place to grow up, lovely, friendly people, nothing bad ever happened. I mean, granted, I was a kid, right? But I had just loved Sierra Leone so much. And then this was all happening in my backyard while I am having this sort of idyllic experience, right? And I was very angry. I had to leave the room. Like I was coming apart. So I like literally ran out of the room and I just started bawling. And I was like, God, what is that? Like, I loved this place. And this girl is buried in my backyard. And she's 7 years old. And she was in the ground in my backyard for 10 days. What
Days.
is that? Like, what in the world? I was so angry. I did not even know what to do with all that I was feeling. And the Lord, like, I ranted for a little while. And the Lord just finally said to me, it was almost sort of a verbal exchange. Like, the Lord said to me, I know, Kim, I saw that little girl. And he's like, and it was a little girl, 9 years old. You were not a full grown adult. You were a little girl. I saw that little girl loving life in Sierra Leone. And I saw that other little girl in the ground. She should have died, Kim, but she didn't because I was with her. And he said, and I knew that 35 years later, those two little girls were going to be sitting in this room together. And one was going to be prepared to bring hope and healing for the other and her friends. And I was like, well, you got the wrong girl. And I just was like so mad.
Wow.
And I was like, no, I can't do that. This is too big for me. And the Lord said, you're right, but it's not for me.
Mm.
And that was when I was like, well, shoot, I guess this was not a consultant trip, as it turns out. And the Lord just really like almost like showed me just a fast movie of my life, like all these things that God had done to prepare me. And he said, I needed you to love this place because otherwise would you be here? You
Wow.
know? And so it was pretty dramatic. And ironically, the rest of the story is I never saw Martha again
Huh.
after that day in that focus group. And I mean, I think she was there for me. And
Listen.
later I asked about her to one of my colleagues there in Sierra Leone. And like a couple of years later, she's like, oh, wait, didn't I tell you? I was like, tell me what? She's like, she died.
Oh.
And I was like, what? From what? They're like, we don't know. She was sick and she died. So I never saw her again.
Wow.
And but I know that the Lord put her in that focus group for me to really as part of my calling, into this ministry. So
Wow.
yeah.
That is powerful. I'm like weeping over here.
Yeah, it was. I was too. So yeah.
I bet. That's amazing. Well, in that time, you have helped so many people. I remember when I was working at Focus on the Family, I did an article about you, and it was like the second Mother Teresa,
Yeah,
basically.
I'm not nearly like that, but yes, you did. Yes, you
Close.
did.
I would say maybe more even.
Yeah, I don't think so. She was pretty amazing.
Yeah, but God has used you to touch so many lives and to help so many people. And I don't know. I think your outlook on life ends up changing when you start seeing people kind of the way Jesus sees them, right?
Yeah.
That he
Yeah.
loved them so much that he was willing to die for them, even
Yeah.
the ones that society throws away,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just tell everyone watching as you wipe the tears from your eyes, like I'm doing, the kind of impact that Kim has had. Kim graduated from, uh, what is it,
Indiana Wesleyan University.
Indiana Wesleyan University, and recently they honored her um, with a plaque, with a World Changers Award. And her picture is now hanging on that campus as a world changer because they've seen the impact that she has had on the lives of so many people around the world. How many countries would you say that you've done these trainings in and all of that, because you've gone all over. I think, didn't you go to
Yeah.
Nepal even?
Nepal, yeah, Central Asia. We've been all over the world. I wish you had told me to prepare that number. Yeah,
Funny.
it's a lot of countries. I don't know exactly how many. And also we do online trainings as well. So a lot of times people will join our online trainings from all different countries around the world as well. So it's a lot. I don't remember the number.
That's
Sorry.
okay. Many countries. So now you see why she's considered a world changer, and I think that's so beautiful. And one thing I've appreciated about our family is that you just go where God calls you. You go and do what the Lord tells you to do, what the Lord puts on your heart to do. And that's what mom and dad did. And they did that in Sierra Leone for a number of years, and went and obeyed the call to go translate the New Testament into the Laka language, and in that process, changed my life forever. For which I'm extremely grateful for, because I probably would be quite literally dead in the bush if it was not for mom and dad going where God called them to, and you following in those footsteps, and our other siblings doing the same, always you know talking to others about Christ, and showing that people are made in the image of God. So I think that's beautiful. I'm totally biased because you're my sister and I just adore you. But I think that people watching will understand and agree with me that you are an incredible person that's made a huge difference for the kingdom of God. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and
Well, thank
sharing
you.
these stories. Wow,
Yeah, thanks for
I could
having me.
talk to you forever about all of this, but we'll cut it off for now, and maybe
All
we'll
right.
have another interview
Yeah.
later on.
I would
Thank
love to at some point come back and even share some of the stories of women who have been transformed by some of the things that have happened, because there's some pretty amazing stories. So yeah, I'd
Okay,
be
I
fun to
want
do
to
that.
do that show, and we will do that show, but just give us one preview.
Oh my gosh. Also didn't prepare that because there's so many. So it's really hard to, but I mean, I'll just say, okay, there's like one of my favorite stories is a woman named Mary who went through our transformation training. That's this book that I showed you earlier. And, completely illiterate, had been an outcast in her village. Really not, no, like she was an outcast and because of her disability. And, learned in the transformation training was learning about God, was learning how she could see herself differently and started to think differently about herself and about her role in her community, and learned a very simple sort of first aid type of intervention on how to mix oral rehydration solution, or ORS, to give to people who are dehydrated from diarrhea or vomiting or whatever. And so in her village, there was a little boy who was about 7, I guess, who was quite sick, and he was very sick. And a lot of people, because they lived in a pretty remote village, like didn't take him to the hospital or clinic or anything, and we're just sort of hoping for the best. But one night around midnight, she was awakened to wailing in the neighbor's house, and was like, oh, it must be this boy. And so she got up, and she was a little bit nervous, but because she's the outcast, right? But she went to the house, and she looked at the boy and realized this boy is not dead. Like the whole place thought he was dead. She realized this boy is not dead. He's unconscious. He probably has been so dehydrated. And so she gathered her courage and said, please bring me a clean bowl or clean cup, some clean water, and some salt and sugar. And she, at midnight in this little hut, like mixed up this oral rehydration solution that she had learned to make in transformation training. And then she took the boy's head in her lap, and she spooned this solution into his mouth all night long, spoonful by spoonful. And in the morning, he opened his eyes and looked at his mom. And she said, take this boy to the hospital and get him treated for whatever is wrong with him. And she became the hero of her village. It just totally changed. I mean, saved the boy's life, because he would have died. He hadn't died yet, but he would have. and saved the boy's life, and then just changed her story completely in her village. So that's just one example. It's one of my favorites because it was just so simple, and she had to really gather her courage because she was an outcast. So to insert yourself into a situation like that, when people have really ostracized you, is pretty hard to do, but she did and saved the little boy's life. So.
Wow. All right, well, that was a little teaser. So next time we get together, we'll do more success stories of the transformation training that you and Accessible Hope provide. And that's what you guys do, really, I think, is provide hope
Yeah.
throughout the world with folks who otherwise might not have any, because of the disabilities they suffer and because of the way their communities and culture treat them. So thank you for the work that you do. It's
Thank you
amazing.
for having me on your show. I appreciate it. It's so
Yeah,
nice.
good. And we'll talk again a
Yes,
lot
we
about
will.
all that, but we'll talk again here on Eternal Impact as well for Divine Family Entertainment. Thank you, Kim. I love you,
Thank
and
you, Tammy.
we'll see you again soon.
All right, thanks.